Throughout the 1950s and 60s, many people longed for equal civil rights. There were many activists hoping for peace and equality for all. However, people had different strategies when it came to fighting for equality. Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and Robert F. Kennedy were just three of the many influential men who advocated and hoped to achieve the same goal, but did so through differing tactics. Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta, Georgia. From a young age, he demonstrated intellect and drive that propelled him to national prominence. He skipped his senior year of high school and went to Atlanta's Morehouse College. King later became a minister at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church. As a minister, King denounced violence and raised much awareness about the civil rights movement. King took over the Montgomery bus boycott in 1955 that ended with the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that segregation on public buses was unconstitutional. This boycott, led by MLK Jr., demonstrated the potential for nonviolent mass protests to successfully challenge racial segregation. King received death threats, hate mail, physical attacks, mass arrests, and the bombing of his home, yet he still continued to be an advocate of nonviolence, where he organized well-publicized boycotts, marches, and demonstrations to protest racial injustice and segregation until his assassination in April of 1968. King is remembered for his I Have a Dream speech, receiving the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, founding the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, and for pressuring Congress to support the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As stated, Martin Luther King Jr. used his nonviolence policy as a way to make advancements in the civil rights movement. Others, however, disagreed with his nonviolent views and believed violence was the only solution. Malcolm X was born in Omaha, Nebraska, originally named Malcolm Little. Malcolm X became the national representative of the Nation of Islam. The Nation of Islam was a group of militant Black Americans who profess Islamic religious beliefs and advocate independence for Black Americans. While in prison, Malcolm's reading and debating skills grew stronger, and he soon became the minister of the Nation of Islam, where he spoke against Black self-hate. The media, both white and Black, portrayed him as a teacher of hate and promoter of violence. However, even with his beliefs in 1963, Malcolm X grew discontented with the Nation of Islam. After being suspended by the leader Elijah Muhammad, Malcolm left the organization, and it was clear that the ties were broken and friendship was no longer being held. In 1965, Malcolm X told interviewer Gordon Parks that the Nation of Islam was actively trying to kill him. Soon after that confession, Malcolm's house was firebombed, and a week later he was killed by Nation of Islam members. Robert F. Kennedy was a white male who supported civil rights. Robert, sometimes called Bobby, assisted MLK in some ways. When Martin Luther King Jr. was in jail, Robert F. Kennedy had heard that the judge refused bail, and so he called the judge himself and stated how King's rights were violated. The next day, after the call was reported in the papers, King was released. Robert Kennedy focused on problems faced by those in poverty even more so than President Johnson did. In 1966, he announced a program to fight poverty in the desperately poor areas of New York City. Robert took up the causes of Blacks, Puerto Ricans, Mexican Americans, and Native Americans. In his 3 years in the Senate, Kennedy's popularity grew even more, and he became known as the champion of the powerless. In 1967, RFK gave his opinions on the Vietnam War and condemned it, and said that the bombing of Vietnamese villages by American planes sickened him. These views portrayed in his speeches drew large crowds and made RFK a hero for many young Americans. Robert announced that he would run for the Democratic nomination for president in the 1968 primary, and he ran on a platform of peace, anti-poverty, civil rights, and social improvement. In April 1968, Kennedy learned that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. He gave an emotional speech as riots broke out in dozens of cities. Sadly, weeks after winning the California primary, making Kennedy the likely Democratic candidate for president, he was shot on June 5, 1968. As one can gather, our lives definitely would not be the same today without these three men and their different tactics. Martin Luther King Jr. preached nonviolence. Malcolm X preached race separation as opposed to integration, and Robert F. Kennedy wanted equal civil rights for African Americans and hoped to face problems in other areas such as poverty. Sadly, all three of these men who were advocates of change were shot and killed. Now we will look at their assassins and what happened the day of their deaths.